Welcome to the Modern Husbands podcast, where every other week we host national thought leaders to discuss how spouses can partner to manage money and the home to live happier lives. Today, we are honored to welcome Ron Lieber. The topic of conversation will be the money conversation no father should miss. Ron Lieber is the author of The Opposite of Spoiled, Raising Kids Who Are Grounded, Generous, and Smart About Money, which was an instant New York Times and Wall Street Journal bestseller. He also wrote The Price You Pay for College, an entirely new roadmap for the biggest financial decision your family will ever make, which was published by HarperCollins in January of 21. Ron has been the Your Money columnist for the New York Times since 2008. Enjoy the show. Ron, we are thrilled that you joined us today.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we want to dive straight into it and make sure our listeners are aware of your expertise, in particular as it pertains to this podcast. Can you provide us just with a real high-level overview of your two recent books, The Price You Pay for College and then The Opposite of Spoiled?
Sure. I'm going to start with The Opposite of Spoiled first, since that's the book that came first. And it was born really of a moment that I had with my first child. So I'm the father of two daughters. One of them is 17 and one of them is 7. When the 17-year-old was 3, we were driving along in the car one day, and out of nowhere, apropos of basically nothing, she pipes up from the back seat and wants to know why we don't have a summer house. And we had not been having conversations about summer houses. It wasn't clear where she got this idea from. We might have visited a friend or two who had a second home, but we were certainly not in the market for one. It's a 2-journalist household. We live in Brooklyn. Such things were certainly out of our reach back then. And I was sort of stunned into silence, right? This kid, all of 39 or 40 months old, had come to the realization that there was this thing out there in the world, this shiny thing that other people had.
Yeah.
She wanted it. Wasn't clear why she wanted it, but she knew she wanted it. And she felt like her parents were not giving it to her. She seemed to sense that was a choice, or she seemed to think that it was a choice, right? And she wanted an explanation. And it might sound like a sort of bratty thing to say, but it actually seemed quite appropriate, because after all, right, any small child, their job is to figure out how the world works, and money and what things cost and what people have and who has what and how that came to pass. That's all a big part of figuring out, what it means to be a human on the planet, right? So it's a totally appropriate question, but I didn't have the faintest idea what to say to her. And, my wife is in the front seat. She thinks this is completely hysterical, right? I play Dr. Money in the newspaper in the New York Times on the weekend, and I can't figure out what to say to this near toddler. So I knew that could not stand. And so I started taking these questions that she was asking me, and also, tougher questions, or other questions, at least from older kids that I was hearing about, that those kids were asking their parents about money. And I started blogging about them. Remember blogs? Whatever it was, 14 or 15 years ago. And this community sort of formed around the questions and the answers. People started asking me to come speak to their communities. And the questions, the sort of pained questions from the parents afterwards, made me realize that this wasn't just a series of blog posts, and it wasn't just a couple of speeches, that people really needed help here. And I think the thing that I seized on initially, that I was most proud of and sort of carried through in the reporting, was the fact that every money conversation is also a conversation about values. Right.
Absolutely.
Right. And so, what you do with what you have says a lot about who you are, and what you say about that to your children can make a big difference in how they approach the world. Right. So that was how I tried to get the thing beyond just sort of like basic nuts and bolts financial literacy. And so that seemed to strike a chord, right? And it was clear that parents had a lot of feelings about this stuff. But as I was writing the book, I realized that, it had to stop somewhere. And a natural stopping point for that book was age 16, because at that point, you're starting to face down college. And I kept running into all of these crazy stories about, the list price and the net price and what was worth it and value and debt and, all of the craziness. And there was just no way that was going to fit into the opposite of spoiled. So I just started sort of tossing that stuff aside into a separate Google Doc and just kind of left it there. And that pile grew for years. I knew there was something there, right? I knew that I was probably going to want to pick up the thread at some point. But it took a while. And again, right, it took readers sort of pounding away at my thick skull to realize what was sort of sitting there in front of me in that Google Doc. People kept coming to me as, I aged and my cohort aged, and they'd say, we've been seeing all this stuff that you've been writing in the newspaper, Ron, about money and feelings and, parenting and values. And, what am I supposed to do about the fact now that, my kid has been granted admission into the Ohio State University, right?
There you go.
Terrific school, $100,000 maybe for 4 years if you get through in 4. Don't qualify for any financial aid. My kid also got into Denison, nice smallish liberal arts college there in Ohio. With the full price, the rack rate, it's $300, $325. Most people don't pay that. They gave us this discount for something called merit aid. I don't even know what that is, right? But they discounted the price to $200,000, even though we could afford to pay full price, barely, right? But then the kid shot the lights out and she got into Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois. And we didn't qualify for any need-based financial aid. And that would cost us $325,000 a year. So Mr. Money Feelings, Parenting Values, big shot, right? Where is the big data that explains to me why Northwestern is $125,000 better than Denison and $225,000 better than the Ohio State University? And I thought, whoa, I have no idea what the answer to that question is. We supposedly live in the world of big data, but, no offense to the academics on the call, people in higher education administration have no real interest in producing ever more data that would allow us to attempt to, rank the institutions on the basis of, any existing metrics that, that we could compute or ones in the future that we might invent. In the absence of data and straightforward thinking, people make decisions on the basis of emotions. And it becomes very easy when you're attempting to create a super steep, exit velocity for your child from your household to the world to persuade yourself that Northwestern's going to look like this and Ohio State's going to look like that, because how could it not with the price tag that big, right?
Right.
And so I realized that, for all of the ink that I had spilled in various New York Times columns about how to save for college and how to pay for college or how not to pay for college, how not to borrow too much, I had missed the most important question of all, which is what to pay for college. And that wasn't just a question about value. It was a question about value.
Right.
What does your family stand for? What does it do with what it has? What's most important, and how do we compute that and act on it? So, after years of not really understanding what I was looking at in front of me, a bunch of readers managed to convince me that there was yet another book to do about money and feelings and values. This one just happened to be about the, most consequential financial decision that any family will probably ever make.
Yeah.
Yep.
I love it, Ron. I love it.
And that's the price you pay for college.
Yeah. As I said, I love both of your books. I got them right there on my bookshelf right there. But to kind of take what you're talking about there and dive a little deeper, as the academic, as the researcher myself, I really do appreciate those who go above and beyond, really to understand the depths of any topic, but, especially a topic like this. And you really did take it to a whole new level with these books. So maybe to help our listeners understand why Our Time Today and really your books, essentially your books, should be treasured. Can you share your research process a little bit more in writing The Opposite of Spoiled and The Price You Pay for College?
Sure. So I think with The Opposite of Spoiled, I really wanted to be grounded in whatever science, whatever research science, social science mostly, existed around how families talk about money and what happens when they do and what happens when they don't. There wasn't a lot of good research. Much of
No.
it was done in the UK, and a lot of that was around, what they refer to in the United Kingdom as pocket money, what we refer to as allowance. And there's a generalized understanding, like pretty good evidence in the data that, people who practice with money end up making slightly better decisions as grown-ups, saving more, getting into less debt. It's never been completely clear whether that's a correlation or whether it's causation. I mean, it's entirely possible that just if you have more money in your household, it's more likely that that you'll have more to practice on, right?
Yeah,
Or that
makes
your
sense.
parents are talking about it more. So there seemed to be, so kind of a mild amount of evidence that doing allowance was a good thing. A fair amount of ink has been spilled among higher education, among education researchers, education professors in particular, and economists around what happens to students when they work in high school, but especially in college, and how, if at all, that affects their grades or their ability to stay in school or succeed afterwards. It's generally understood that working for money is a good thing. So those were, sort of the basics, and then there's some sociology work that had been done around parenting styles. And there was a sort of a pretty good framework of understanding of, how best to, sort of talk to kids generally and supervise them. And there's these sort of like 4 quadrants. I'm going to forget the exact terminology, but, it's out there in the sociological literature. And so, this was all helpful. But it became clear to me pretty quickly that what I needed to do more than anything, once I had grounding in the literature as it existed, was just to talk to as many families as possible and find ones that were like essentially on the lunatic fringe of awesomeness in, sort of
That's such a great phrase.
transparency or like stunt work. I've got to call out Brian here because I can't remember whether this went into the book. I mean, what Brian and I did together a bunch of years ago, and I read about it in the Times back when it happened, is something that I suppose a family could do. I've never heard of one actually doing it, but Brian, used to take this bus full of kids out from his classroom and take a sort of grand tour of the sort of the world of financial services for people who live paycheck to paycheck and may not have a bank account, right? So
Yeah.
he would pile his kids in a yellow school bus and they'd go and visit pawn shops, and they'd visit check cashing firms, and they'd visit rent-a-centers, like rent-to-own furniture companies. And so basically, I was looking for people who parent the way that Brian used to teach, right? Who would go to great lengths to teach their kids a valuable lesson, right? So, I spent time hanging out with a farm family in Utah that had 9 sons, and the sons ran, the entire like dairy cattle operation. And, the 5-year-old drove the tractor, and the 7-year-old would, take the overgrown baby bottles out of the back, and the 9-year-old would slip them into the calf pens. And, the older boys were back in the dairy barn hooking up the machines. And, there was the family where the dad came home one day with, all $17,000 of his paycheck in like $20 bills, and then proceeded to like dump it all on the kitchen table and have a big family discussion about how the money got divided each month. And they like divided it in the actual pile. So, I was looking for kind of outsized personalities that would go to sort of any length to, drive a point home with their kids and get them talking about stuff. And then I endeavored to try to be that parent myself.
And that story you just told was one of my favorites, because it's so salient for kids to hold the money in their hands and recognize the amount of money that really contributes to their own well-being by just dividing the money up on the table, as you were saying.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I mean, it was visceral, right?
Yes.
But the thing that I talked to some of the older kids who were at the table that day about it, and they said the thing that was so incredible for them to see was that it seemed like a really large amount of money, and it is, right? I mean, that family had a way above average household income, and yet that was a large family, 6 or 7 siblings. And by the time they were done with every last thing they had to pay for each month, including baseball league this, and soccer lesson that, and the oboes here, and the whatever else on the weekend, there was literally nothing left of thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. And I think that was as good of a lesson as any that you can use to teach kids that money really is a scarce resource, and it's possible, even if you're comfortable, to run out in any given week or month. And that's why you got to be careful.
Well said.
It's so interesting too, that because all the research shows that, the more intangible money becomes, when we're tapping to pay, or product marketers think even better yet, when we just have our payment information saved and we can tap in an app to pay for something, like the easier it is to, the more intangible it is, the less it hurts to part with it. And these stories are all ways and instances in which money has become more tangible for young people, their families. It's so inspiring. Thanks for sharing.
Sure.
I would love to get into the next book. So my personal connection to personal finance is I watched my family, my own parents really struggle and feel and express quite a bit of anguish over the college selection process, paying for it, and also went through a lot of that same anguish myself when it came time to pay back the many thousands of dollars of student loans that I ended up taking out. So it's sort of this bridge of anguish and anxiety between me and my family. It's like imprinted on my soul. So this is really personal for me, and that's why I believe that your book, The Price You Pay for College, is so crucial for people to read. But what I would love to do, I don't want to cheapen the work that you've done here, but what I would love to hear is, what are 3 lessons, 3 salient lessons that parents, young people can take away from The Price You Pay for College?
Sure. Well, I want to pivot off what you said, and thank you for sharing that. I feel exactly the same way. My parents split up when I was in middle school. My dad lost his job. He didn't earn, much of any income to speak of for a couple of years. We were me and my younger siblings were sort of like, we went to private school at the time. We were sort of thrown at the mercy of the, financial aid gods there. By the grace of those gods, we were not evicted from the school for lack of ability to pay. But, when it came time to apply to college, we didn't have the money that we needed for the places that I wanted to go. And it was, sort of a grand scramble to try and figure out how the financial aid system worked, and then attempt to, work the system and beat it. I did end up with a really good financial aid package. it only took me 10 years to pay back my loans. But you come out of that as a parent, and hey, even if you don't come out, even if you sailed through and your parents were able to write checks from current income, what's happening now is, as a parent, right, is that we all want our kids, I don't want to say all, right, but we all come to the table with our own experiences, and we either want things to be better than they were for us, or we feel strongly, in the very least, that we want them to be different in some way. But it's very rare that anybody approaches the process as a parent with a totally even keel, right? So you asked for a list of 3. I mean, I spent a lot of time running around America trying to sort of plumb the depths of the emotional soul of American parents when it comes to the process of figuring out what to pay for college. And there were 3 feelings that seemed to govern the process, sometimes all at once, everywhere I went. And I think more than almost anything else, like, if we really want to be emotionally intelligent about this process, these are the things that we have to look out for. And none of these feelings are bad, right? They're natural, but we have to be conscious of them, right? So the first one is fear, right? Fear that you, Christian Cheryl, or me, Ron Lieber, is going to end up putting our kids in exactly the same situation that we were put in, right? Or if we're lucky enough not to be able to be able for that not to happen, fear that they're going to go tumbling down the social class ladder that we may have spent all this time and energy trying to sort of clamber up again, right? Fear of falling, right? Fear that the American birthright of each generation doing better than the last one will end with us because of something that we do wrong, a choice that we make, right? And maybe we're not earning enough, right? Maybe you're not earning enough, Christian, right? Maybe you're not saving enough, right? Or maybe you're going to cheap out, right, and send your kid to the state school instead of ponying up $100,000 or $200,000 more, perhaps with debt, right? To send your kid to where she or he thinks they need to go, right? And if something doesn't work out when they're 24, it's all going to be your fault, right? So you're afraid. You're afraid that that's where you're headed. Or maybe you've drawn a line in the sand, or your spouse has drawn a line in the sand and said, we're not spending more than $75,000, and anything else is up to the kid, right? So maybe then you feel guilt, right? Guilt that you're not solving for the problem that you had a generation ago, or guilt that you've chosen a profession where you just aren't going to be able to earn enough to help the way that you would like to, or guilt about. I mean, there's so many ways to send ourselves on guilt trips, right? So there's fear, there's guilt, and then there's snobbery and elitism, right? You're sitting there in Shaker Heights, Ohio, and the kid's gotten into the Ohio State University, maybe even the honors college, right? But they get that shiny Northwestern letter in the mail on April 3rd. And man, it is just so hard to resist that, right? Super rejective university, 90% of the people who apply don't even get in, right? It's sort of a fancy nameplate, maybe it means something, on Wall Street or to, some venture capital firm that, Ohio State might not. I mean, they're both Big Ten schools, they're in the same league, but one's a lot harder to get into than the other, right? And so it's easy to think about the window sticker, in the car, or the Instagram sweatshirt, reveal, and the pat on the head that you'll get as the parent of, that child who has achieved and accomplished all that, even though, this stuff is like an unregulated lottery at this point, but nobody really knows that or dares to talk about it that way in public, right? So, you want that gold star trophy for parenting, or the kid does, or maybe even if you've got your own snobbery or elitism under control, you're worried about other people's snobbery and elitism, right? What's the partner at McKinsey going to say if, about your 17-year-old who wants nothing more than to be a fancy management consultant or a Wall Street investment banker, or to go, be a grunt in the, data-driven Boston Red Sox, baseball operations, department, right? Where there are a bunch of snobs who all, went to Northwesterns and Cornells, right? And didn't go to state schools, right? I mean, what about other people's snobbery? Gonna cheap out, right? And put your kid, in a position where they'll be, subject to somebody else's snobbery? I don't know, right? So like, these are the feelings, right? It's not wrong to have any of them. I'm not even sure it's wrong to act on any of them. In at least some instances, but if you're not being hyper aware of your own emotional state, then you're probably doing it wrong.
Yeah. I mean, the affect heuristic, which is a behavioral psychology term for basically like we make decisions far more often based on emotion in the moment than based on any concrete information, price, quality, return on investment considerations, et cetera. And that brain defect of ours is like an evolutionary thing that helps us make quick decisions based on, fear, like fight or flight response. But in the case of something that takes like such a measured, nuanced approach as figuring out what to pay for college, that can lead us astray. So my goodness, what you've just shared resonated with me, like speaking of imprinted on my soul. My goodness. That's incredible.
That's what they pay me for. I'm trying, 15 years of money equals feelings at the New York Times. I'm still trying to conquer my own, but in the very least, I can help everybody else, rub their own nose in their own feelings.
Ron, when you were working through those examples, those feelings, what strikes me is that when we make individual decisions, then it's easy to be frugal or cheap, and you don't feel guilty about it. You almost, at least I take pride in many of those decisions. But personal finance is more personal than finance, but more importantly, it's even more personal when it impacts the people that you love the most. And that's really hard when you have a spouse that, has, certain ambitions themselves, certain values themselves, but in a more complicated way, it's very challenging, as you said, to your emotional soul with children, because I constantly wrestle, and friends of mine constantly wrestle with how much is enough and how much is too much. Because even if you can provide everything that they want, are you really doing them a favor? And I went through this as a young parent. I wish that you would have written your book 10 years before. It probably could have saved me a bleeding ulcer and working 80 hours a week. But, when my youngest kid was in a public school that cut the gifted program, and he was in it. And what do you do as an educator? And you've got a kid that, is scoring off the charts. What are you going to do? Are you going to let him fail? And, so this wave of emotion came to me, and we were able to support him to go to probably arguably the best independent private school in like the 3-state area. And it was hard. And then we had more kids, and, they were pretty bright, and you just find yourself making up the difference in cost with just work and more work and more work. And the challenge that parents face is this ongoing tug of war with time that you need to work to pay for what you're going to provide, and the time that it takes away that you should be spending with your family. And that's what I loved about when I pulled your two books together. Kind of one of the greatest lessons was quantifying the fact that it's okay to say no. It's okay to look at your child and say,
we can't, instead of saying we can't afford that, which might be a lie, as you bring up in your book, say, I won't pay for that. And let me explain why, because I value my time more with you than I do working away from you so we can afford to do X, Y, Z.
Mhm.
And I want to share one final thing before I ask you about the opposite of spoiled. And it's that when I read your book, it was the first time that I could like put two and two together with my own passion for personal finance, because it didn't come from numbers. You know, when people talk about personal finance, they think of like spreadsheets and credit scores, and you know, those are concepts that you can learn in a classroom, but it doesn't drive most of your decisions. And what drives my passion and my decisions are my values that were passed down from my father. And when I read your book, it occurred to me, I don't really necessarily love personal finance, but I love the fact that I can use personal finance to help other children and parents and my own family understand how we can take money and put it to work in a way that makes their lives happier and better.
Hmm.
And so if you wouldn't mind, could you share two or three of your favorite stories from the opposite of spoiled that perhaps do a good job helping our listeners understand what they can do, lessons, which are all hands-on lessons, that they can do with their children to do that exact same thing?
Well, now you've put me into a sort of existential tailspin, Brian, because I'm trying to figure out now, do I not actually love personal finance? Do I just love what it can do?
Right.
Do I love the conversations that it can start if it's done right? That's kind of a profound question. You know, I didn't do so well in the maths in college, in the numerical classes. But maybe it's no accident that, you know, I grew up to be the person who tries to, you know, explain this stuff. It's interesting to contemplate. But to your question, gosh, where to start? So my 7-year-old just lost her fourth tooth or fifth tooth. So, you know, we're thinking a lot about the tooth fairy these days. And you know, it's because you're often not prepared. You should be prepared, right? The tooth is loose, you know it's going to fall out reasonably soon, but you know, it happens somewhat suddenly, and then you've got to be like ready, you know, for the tooth fairy to come. And you know, I kept hearing these stories. I weren't sure if they were apocryphal about, you know, parents in some of the, you know, wealthier suburbs of Westchester County, you know, up north of New York City here, you know, dropping $100 bills under their kids' pillows. You know, that I felt like was not, that it didn't feel like the right answer to me, just, you know, going ever higher with inflation. You know, I don't know which tooth fairy they're hiring up there, but I wanted a different one. So, you know, I sort of put out word, and I got a couple good responses back. So there were an old friend who I'd grown up with, she and her husband out in California had this ritual where every time a kid would lose a tooth, the tooth fairy would show up with a different animal tooth that would go under the pillow, right? So like you use your, you know, human tooth, lose your human tooth, and like you wake up the next morning and there's a shark tooth there. How do you know that it's a shark tooth? Well, the tooth fairy has written a letter to you in invisible ink backwards and slipped it under your pillow. So you've got to, you know, make the ink visible and then hold it up to a mirror and read the letter in the mirror to figure out where the tooth came from. And every time, you know, you lose a tooth, you get a different animal tooth, and you have this whole collection of animal teeth. And it turns out there's this website where you can go to buy the animal teeth that these parents had figured out. Another couple I know here in Brooklyn, New York, both of them travel a fair bit for work. And so they constantly had this, random collection of coins that, were essentially useless unless they were going to go back to these countries. So they just started hoarding the coins. And every time the kid would lose a tooth, they would get a coin and then a children's book that was set in the country that the coin came from.
Brilliant.
So, you can get super creative with this stuff. I really love that. Then on the back end,
I have to share one quick thing, Ron. When you tell that story, what makes me, the first thing that my mind goes to is for parents who are trying to find ways to connect with their kids and have meaningful conversations. Because as you point out, you can't lecture them. You can't decide, I'm going to teach my child A, B, and C on the car ride to school. It has to come about from some sort of experience that, as you just illustrated or explained, can be from the tooth fairy, So these kids are probably getting lessons on currencies from other countries, but just the country themselves, or maybe their favorite animal. So anyhow, I love that because of what it results in for parents and kids having meaningful connections and conversations.
Yeah. So, on the backside, I've got a couple of colleagues who their last kid graduated from college, I think 4 or 5 years ago. So they had 4 kids, both journalists, lived relatively modestly. And, private college was going to be a stretch for their family, but they managed to make it work. And one of the ways they made it work was they said to each kid, when they got to the second half of 8th grade, hey, sit down, we need to have a conversation with you. We just want you to know that you're going to be responsible for the first semester of tuition yourself. So, we're kind of long past the age where you can work your way through school in 4 years. You just can't earn enough at this point, unless you're on some serious financial aid, and these kids were not going to be. And so, they said to them, look, this one's going to be on you, and we're going to, we're telling you now because, we expect you to work every summer. They didn't work during the school year. Turns out the summer was going to be enough if they worked 50, 60, 70 hours a week. And so, these kids went to work, delivering newspapers and scooping ice cream and scrubbing the toilets at the beach. And eventually they became lifeguards, and they worked double shifts, and they got overtime. And, the last one graduated, whatever it was, 3 or 4 years ago, and, had to pay about, I think it was $24,000, for their first semester tuition. But it turns out you can do that at, $12 or $14 an hour, if you hustle and get better and better jobs each summer. And, the complaint or the concern, at least I always hear from families, is, well, summer is supposed to be for enrichment, right? Your kids should be off, getting published in scientific journals or whatever. And, there's not a lot of kids who can actually accomplish that at the age of 16. We seem to be defining internship down such that 15-year-olds now have them. But, if you're doing that to impress a college admissions officer, I can promise you that they're laughing at your 15-year-old's quote unquote internship. There are not a lot of kids work 60 hours a week during the summer, even though they don't qualify for need-based financial aid. So, if you're looking for, a way to stand out, that might actually be a way. And it turns out those kids did okay. Harvard, MIT, Northwestern, and College of Charleston. So, they got into some good schools.
Yeah, yeah, you can say that again. So, go ahead, Christian.
That whole thing doesn't work out. The kids could just move to Westchester, claw hammer, knock a bunch of teeth out, and boom, that's at least, I don't know.
Oh my gosh.
How many teeth you got? My goodness, that's insane.
I know Christian and I were talking about a recent Netflix series. What was it called, Christian?
You talking about She Said?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is a great mystery that we are going to need to solve here. Just to keep our audience on the edge of their seats down the back stretch of this particular podcast episode with the legendary Ron Lieber. What do you have to do with She Said?
Yeah, so somehow my modern husbandry has been depicted in a major motion picture. It was not the it was not the thing that I expected to have on my CV. But basically, what happened was, so my wife and I are colleagues in addition to spouses and partners in parenting. So she's an investigative reporter at the New York Times, and she was one of the two reporters. Her name's Jodi Cantor. And along with Megan Toohey, who was her sort of partner in crime or crime revelation, as the case may be, they were the ones who did all of the reporting that exposed Harvey Weinstein. And they wrote a book about it called She Said. Basically, it was a sort of a journalistic procedural, basically kind of, how they got the story and what happened afterwards. And the book was optioned, and it was turned into a major motion picture called She Said, which came out a couple of months ago at the end of 2022. And our family was depicted. A terrific actor named Adam Shapiro played me in the movie. Our daughters appear as characters as well. And you see me once or twice in the newsroom, but the rest of the scenes are at home. And they're about the intense experience of attempting to parent at the same time that you're going through a deeply emotional and extremely complicated process of exposing bad guys and telling the truth at work, and how those things all kind of intersect and overlap, and pull everybody in 100 directions at once.
Can you share how are you able, and how is Jodi able to take kind of the fear of that circumstance? If I remember correctly, she was being followed, right? At one point by Harvey Weinstein hired people to follow her. How were you able to compartmentalize such a significant fear and then go home and be so emotionally intelligent and handle being a parent at the same time? Was there a strategy that you use, a trick?
Yeah. So here's the thing, right? When all of that reporting was going on, Jodi and Megan did not know if they were going to get the story. They certainly didn't know that if they got the story, whatever that would mean, right? Because you don't know what the truth is until you go looking for it, right? So whatever story they got, it wasn't clear to them, even if they did get it, what kind of impact it had. Looking back now, it all seems obvious, but they pressed the button on that, and they really were not sure that anybody would care. But what they did know, and what we'd been warned about, was that Harvey Weinstein is a bully, right? He's a jerk, and he had people followed before, but he was not about, for the most part, public confrontations or trying to do physical harm to people in public outside of one-on-one, where he was in a room alone with a woman who he could overpower, right? So we didn't have any reason to be worried about our safety. He was just a creepy bully who was going to try to, intimidate the reporters and intimidate the newspaper. We actually didn't know that it was happening at the time. We assumed it was. It all came out later after the story was published, exactly what he had done and what he tried to do. And then some weird things that had happened all of a sudden began to make sense. But there was really nothing creepy or scary about it, to be honest. We were not leaving the apartment, sort of looking both ways, or wondering if somebody was going to, come and get us. We have colleagues every day who put their lives on the line, in Ukraine, or in other war zones, or do very dangerous reporting, both inside and outside of the United States. The work that Jody and Megan did required a lot of bravery, but they were not exposed to much physical danger.
Was it more challenging going through that, to come home and kind of like take your work hat and hang it up, and then put your parenting hat on and be really in tune with the little things, as you started the podcast, just a little question that you can run with of, why don't we have a summer home, right? Because you really have to have this, you've got to be really in tune with your child at that time, and really be present to capitalize on those moments of inquiry.
Yeah, well, I mean, what was going on inside of our apartment at that point was, and some of this is depicted in the movie. I mean, my dad was starting to slowly circle the drain, after his ALS diagnosis. So, I was up and down to Florida, trying to sort of keep track of the situation down there. And people, including sexual assault victims, were calling at all hours. Some of them were coming to our apartment, including some pretty famous people who didn't want to be seen with Jody, in Los Angeles or anywhere in public in New York. And it was basically impossible to keep our older daughter from, sort of understanding what was happening. She had grown out of asking about summer houses, but now she was hearing about sexual assault, and she knew what that was already. She had, picked it up in a book somewhere. And so she understood kind of what was at stake, and what her mom was sort of trying to prove. And so the questions were a different order of magnitude of complexity. And that's depicted in the movie, actually, in a really lovely way. They made Talia younger in the movie than she actually was, with slightly more innocent questions. But it's what they did, I thought was pretty gripping dramatically, and sort of relatively true to life in terms of how emotionally wrenching some of it was. And it was a tricky thing to parent through. But it was much more tricky, for my wife, I think, than for me, because she was living with the magnitude of the stories that she was hearing, day in and day out for so many months, while not being sure if she would ever be able to publish them, and if she did, if anyone would care.
Well, you and Jody are incredible parents, and just the world's lucky that you put pen to paper and shared your parenting ideas and how you can use money to bring about some of those strategies. And I know that our listeners are going to value this podcast. I know we certainly do. Ron, thanks for being on today.
It's my pleasure. Anything to help, and I'm glad to be here.
Christian, Dr. Ross, and I thank our listeners and our guest. Please be sure to go to modernhusbands.com, where you can subscribe to our podcast. You can listen to our podcast in whatever platform you prefer: Apple, Spotify, Amazon Music, or even on YouTube. Until next time, be well.